I'm happy to introduce the second speaker, Nancy Kula, who is Deputy Dean of Partnerships and Professor in the Department of Language and Linguistics at the University of Essex in the Great Britain. Her research interests are in descriptive and theoretical linguistics, mainly in morphology and phonology. She works also on Bantu languages, as well as endangered languages and African linguistics in general. Nancy runs the phonology research group as well in Essex, I guess. And I first met Nancy in person. I was thinking about it. When did I meet Nancy first? And I think our paths crossed the first time in New Orleans at one of the other annual conference on African linguistics meeting in 2012. So Frank I met in 2011 and Nancy I met in 2012, I think. And after that, we met in many different conferences like on Bantu languages and African languages in general. So it's good to have you here today. Thank you for joining, for presenting your work. And today Nancy will talk about pre-focus expansion and prosody-phonology mismatches.
So I'm trying to share my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen. So.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you very much, and thanks very much, Seunghun, and your lovely lab for this invitation. Very happy to be here. I have changed the sort of focus of my talk, and essentially I was sort of hoping to talk about something, looking at some new data which I have on different genres of intonation in Bemba, but that sort of didn't really quite work. So I've changed that totally. So the part in black is really what my talk is about, and essentially maybe the only connection is to say that looking at these phenomena, it would be the data that I'm going to look at are very controlled data, which are not very naturalistic. So it would be really nice to see what's happening in naturalistic data, which is what I would have hoped to have presented on today. Moving. So this is the structure of the talk. It's not that long. On each of these things, I sort of don't speak for very long. And the other thing that I would like to say overall is that this is a very, very descriptive talk, which is just sort of trying to begin to understand what could be going on in Bemba from the perspective of trying to understand maybe a little bit further what's going on in the intonation of focus on questions in Bantu languages. So I will talk a little bit about constituent questions. By this, I mean questions where you've got an actual question word, and then look at the intonation of what it looks like in multiple questions, and then try to compare that with focus constructions, as we were just sort of discussing at the end of Frank's talk, in terms of there's a connection between focus and questions to see whether we see something similar. And then I'll look just like a slide or two on sort of polar questions to see what the contrast is in terms of the intonation, and then look a little bit about at compression. And that's really interesting in light of the stuff that that Frank was saying just now, and trying to sort of find out whether could this be a correlate of focus or questions in Bemba. And then I will look at the phonological marking of focus in terms of phonological phrasing, absolutely briefly, and then a little bit about some prosody-phonology mismatches that I'm seeing. I'm not quite sure yet, and it'll be interesting to hear what some of you might have to say about this in the question time. And then I'll sort of have a slide with a couple of conclusions. So just to give a very, very short background, Bemba is a Bantu language, and Eastern Bantu languages that is spoken mainly in Zambia, but also spoken in parts of the DRC. There are a couple of dialects. Actually, there are many dialects, and we know a little bit about sort of 3 dialects. I will be talking mainly about the Central Copper dialect today. There are high and low tones, and in the Bantu perspective, we assume that the underlying tones are high versus nothing, and the low tones get, probably inserted after all of the phonology is applied. There's a contrast between contrastive, by which I mean lexical tones, where words there are minimal pairs of words which are contrasted by tone, but also grammatical tone, where tone, might be used in particular tense aspect mood markers. And then, like many Bantu languages, there are many tonal processes which involve mainly the spreading of the high tone, which is the most active one. And some of this tonal spreading correlates with phonological phrasing. And I think I only have very little on that, but it might be an interesting and important connection to make as well. The important or the significant, most common characteristic in the intonation of Bemba in what we know so far is that there tends to be final lowering in almost all sentence types, at least of the work that we have so far. So declarative sentences are going to have final lowering, the same thing with questions, as well, and other sort of embedded clauses also tend to have final lowering as well. In terms of the sentence structure, it's, like all Bantu languages, it's SVO. So in terms of the topic today, cross-linguistically focus in most languages, also a little bit like we saw in Frank's talk, focus constituents show prosodic prominence, and we see that in a number of languages, like we saw already you see that in German and in English, it's fairly common. Bemba is amongst those languages where this is not the case, so you don't get a prominence on the focus, and we see that in a number of languages. We see that Laura Downing has argued that also for Chichewa. We also see that from some of Frank's work on Akan as well, and it's something that we have seen more and more, cross-linguistically as well. But in Bemba in particular, there isn't any prominence on the focus, but there seems to be some indication of focus or some kind of prominence in the prefocal position. So this is really interesting, that also sort of complements very well what Frank was talking about earlier, that he was talking about the post-focus position, and I was talking about the pre-focus position. And we didn't plan to both wear blue shirts for this sort of focal conversation. So the pre-focus marking, interestingly, doesn't match with phonological phrasing, or at least one has to think interestingly, what is the phonological phrase that is being marked by this? And that's kind of one of the questions that I have that I'll be coming to at the end. It somehow matches, and maybe this is something which is more for all of my Bantu friends in the audience, it kind of matches a process which is what's called a conjoint disjoint distinction. I won't talk a lot about it, but I'll just kind of explain a little bit what it is. So it doesn't seem to match what we think of as phonological phrasing, but it seems to mark this conjoint disjoint marking. And this conjoint disjoint distinction in Bantu is something that is correlated, usually correlated with focus. But I'll come back to that for everybody who doesn't know so much about that. With respect to the data, I am not really, so all of these data were sort of data which were recorded with 3 different speakers producing specific sentences 5 times each, and the analysis is done with drawing generalizations across the different data. And I'm not going to be presenting all of the data in the way that it is here in one, but I just wanted to give this example as an example of the structure of Bantu, so to speak. So there's a subject, the teacher, and then you've got a verb, and the verb usually has got a lot of markings on it. It's got a subject marker, it's got a tense aspect marker. At this point, this one doesn't have one. And then you've got the verb and the final vowel, and sometimes there can be suffixes at the end of the vowel, if I always true. So I'm here. And this is a question, this is an object question. So here there's it's questioned in situ, and then there's an adverb here. And then of course there's going to be tone marking on all of them, but we're going to see all of these data on the pitch tracks themselves. So it might be that there are combinations of the vowels, and I think the details, I've sort of decided to sort of not the details of what each of these words are. Maybe it's not so important. I'm really interested in looking a little bit at what the intonation is doing, and of course I am happy to come back and talk about what the structure of a particular sentence might be. So this is the second one is also an example of an object question. So the children saw the subject marker on the verb, and then who at the school. So essentially, this is just to say, this is kind of what the data would look like if I presented each of them separately, but decided to sort of not do that for this particular occasion, and you'll just see them on the pitch tracks. So starting with constituent questions, and by constituent questions, I want to talk about those questions which are questioned with a particular question word. So here the question word is actually the sentence that we saw before. It's this one, it's ninchi, and the sentence translation is always going to be given in the very last tier of the representation. So the teacher teaches what today, and it's going to correlate with where the boundaries of the words are in the full form, which has got the sentence in it in Bemba. In the second tier, in this one, it's going to be the lexicotones which are going to be given. So like I said, in Bemba, you have got high tone spreading like in most Bantu languages. So I'm only going to show what the lexicotones are here. And the idea is if you see any lexicotones following this, then it would have been from spreading. And I would be happy to talk about how this spreading is applying, but essentially just to have an idea of where the lexical tones are in the representations. And then the second tier is going to have the intonational cues or the intonational tones that I think are sort of going on. So here there is a subject, and at the end of the subject there is a boundary law, which is something which you have in after the subject in Bemba. And then at the very end there is also a law which gives us this final lowering in the sentence. So for this question, the question word is here and she, and there isn't really very much raising that you see in the pitch track, but there is raising before that, which is what I'm sort of considering this to be the raising that I'm seeing before the question word itself, which is on the verb. And in terms of what roughly, at least for the three female speakers that are represented in all of these data, their sort of regular pitch track is around 150 hertz. And really, when we're moving into the higher ones, 200 hertz, I'm sort of treating that or seeing that to be as some kind of expansion. And I'm going to make a correlation with also what you see when you have a declarative and a polar question, that you can sort of see that raising in the pitch, which I assume is kind of going on here. And then maybe the question is then, how does one mark this? Is there a left edge, which is what's given here in the representation? Is there a left edge high intonational tone, which is raising this? But then what is the domain that it covers, since it doesn't raise the whole of the constituent? So it seems as if the raising is limited to only being in the pre-focus position, if we think that questions are inherently focused. And then we're going to sort of have the focus data to see how this compares with that. This is another question, to use another question word, which is who here, which is vani. And here again, you see that there is the regular, so the regular point of where the normal intonational curve starts, the pitch track, the pitch range starts around here, but then you sort of have this raising which starts somewhere in the domain which is before the focus, or at least before the question word. So all of these data, I also have to say, were not specifically collected for dealing with this particular phenomenon. So I'm just sort of riding on the back of some data that I have on intonation in Bemba, and therefore doing this again, it would be that one sort of controls, a little bit more to not have all of these breaks in the pitch tracks by having, these obstruents like in this context. But of course, the contrast in terms of what you're seeing, that you have got a raising that is somewhere before the question word itself, is very, very apparent. This is another example where we have got another object question. The children saw whom at the school. Again, we see some kind of raising, and within that raising, in the constituent which is before the question word, we also have downstep. And this is interesting and crucial from the point of view of a question, because in polar questions, generally in Bemba, you don't get any downstep. So when you have raising, you don't get downstep within that raising in a polar question. But in this instance, within this raising that you're getting for the pre-question word focus, you actually see that downstep is applying in this context. And of course, this is making me wonder, is there something different about the kind of raising that you're seeing before a question word in this instance than that you would see in a polar question? Instances in all of the examples, we are seeing final lowering still happening at the end. And again, for lack of a better way of sort of expressing this, I'm just expressing this expansion that we are seeing before the question word as being indicated by an intonational high tone on the left edge. So in terms of how much raising that one sees on the verb, I thought that it might be interesting to sort of try and see what is the difference between the verb that precedes the question word in terms of what the F0 is, in contrast to the complement or the word that's sort of following the verb. And you can see here, I sort of also have the data for a polar question where there is no question word, and we are going to see an example of that soon. We see that in contrast to what we see actually starting with the declarative, so the declarative is a bit higher than the than the complement, but certainly when you look at a polar question and the other kinds of question, and there's a contrast here that I'm showing between whether the question word is in situ or is in final position, because it can also be moved to final position. It seems to be, averaging around 180 hertz. But I think the really crucial thing is that the difference between that and the following constituent. So overall, in terms of what the F0 is of a question, whether there's a question word or a polar question, it seems as if it's, the fall that we are seeing at the end after the question word is still much higher than we are seeing in a declarative sentence. So these values are sort of averaged over three repetitions in each case. So now I thought it might be interesting to look at multiple questions. And here again, this is, these are sort of elicited data. In naturalistic data, you really don't get multiple questions, very often. They're not ungrammatical, and you can create contexts where you ask people to sort of produce these forms. So I would sort of also like to sort of say that, keeping in mind that these are not necessarily naturalistic data, but not necessarily ungrammatical, but they're not sort of so frequently occurring in terms of having two question words. So here as well, so here the questions are vani and inshi. These are the two, which are the question words. And again, we sort of see that it's kind of, it goes up a little bit here from the lexical high tone, but otherwise there was a fall which is coming from the preceding constituent, which had gone pitch raising. And here, I don't indicate it here, but this is a subject marker high, which is lexical. This is also a lexical high, so there's a downstep here. And you can see that it sort of went high initially, and then there's a downstep, stays up at this downstep, but then by the time we're coming to the questions, starts to go down. And then, much flatter at the end with having final lowering on the right-hand side. So it looks like both for, single, you've got a single question word, and also when you've got multiple questions, we seem to have the same structure. And I'm showing here, it's also possible to flip the order of the questions. And I think there's also work that you see usually, so Bemba is sort of asymmetric in having a benefactive object always preceding the theme object, but in questions you see that it's possible to reverse this. And I also know from FIPA, from work that Christina Rido and Cédric Tatin have done, that they also see there that there is a flipping of the question word order, which is not so strict. But again, nothing really changes in terms of what we are seeing from the intonation. We see no prominence that's being given to the question word, but some prominence that is occurring before. And here again, this is an example where you go up after the subject, avana, and then you have a downstep in this context as well. So now coming to focus, so this was what we see in the context of when you've got a question and you've got a question word. Now coming to constituents where we have focus. So here, this is a sentence which is in response to, so these were all always paired sentences where someone asks, what is he cooking today? So everything is given, what is he cooking? Cooking, the verb is given, today is given, and the response is going to be, and again here by focus, I'm essentially dealing only with the new information focus, but actually the facts for contrastive focus look pretty much the same. So here, the new information that's coming in is uwali, which is, Mishima, a wonderful, wonderful food. So here again, you see that he is cooking much, much higher. You see this pitch raising, but then everything else just goes flat after that. And then, yeah, so in terms of compression, the question is also going to be, does it just go flat here? And then there's a real final lowering at the end on the right-hand side. So I have these data here in terms of like you listening to them in terms of the question. The question is asked first, and then the answer is given. So the first part is going to be, what did he cook today? And then the second is going to be, he cooked wali today. But then you don't get this prominence on wali.
Bakafundisha baleipika enshi lero. Baleipika wali lero.
So it is baleipika wali lero. So baleipika is the one which goes up, and then everything else kind of goes down. This is a similar example where there was, a scenario that was created about, teaching, a person, Chisanga, and he gets instructions, and then somebody asked the question, does he get instructions every day? When does he get instructions? So it's really pushing for you to give the new information being on Saturday is when he gets the instruction. But again, the structure, Vamufunda pachiverushi. So you get the first part where you get much more prominence on the first part, and then pachiverushi, which is Saturday, is fairly flat. So it seems as if there's this raising which is happening before, and then when the focus, the constituent, which is actually the new information, seems to just be going flat after that. So now I wanted to show you an example of polar questions to see to what extent. So polar questions are something which are, unambiguously analyzed as being marked by having pitch pitch expansion or raising. And then if you look at this in terms of where, this is, within the same data set with the same speakers, the amount of raising or expansion that you're seeing is very much around the 200 Hertz mark. So this is a sentence, there's a question particle, and I don't know if I showed it in the other examples, but when you've got questions, where you've got a question word, you can also have a question particle and the question word as well. So the question particle is not really, it's, you can have an echo question, a polar question where you don't have the particle, but you can also have it. So here, this is a polar question. The children will solve a shorts, so to speak, with a sort of question intonation. What we see here is that everything is kind of raised, and I'm going to show you next picture to show the flat one. I should have started with that really. So this is raised, but the kind of raising of or the pitch expansion that we are seeing here seems to stay, fairly consistent throughout. Even though we get something which is always consistent after the subject, a low, we get it here, and then we also get the low at the very end. So this is the oh yes, I don't know, I have these. This is another polar question where everything is raised, and in this case, actually, there is a suspension of downstep. So here you may recall that when we had the subject marker va, and I'm using exactly the same word with pela, which has got a lexical high, when we saw it in the constituent question data, there was downstep here. But here we see no downstep. When we've got expansion, the whole thing stays up. So this is the question. Will the women, give the bread? But still a sort of little fall at the end. Everything stays up and then a little fall at the end. So a contrast in terms of what we saw with respect to focus, where when there's a focus constituent or when there's a question word, we saw that downstep continue to apply in those cases, and that might be something that is telling us something about what the structure might be like for the questions and for the focus. This is just overlaying the example that we saw just now with the declarative sentence. So the black one here is the declarative sentence, which goes up at the start, but then gradually starts going gradually down immediately, in contrast to the one where there's a question, where it's a question where we see pitch range expansion. So this is just kind of trying to show that the pitch range expansion that one is arguing for is actually able to be seen when you sort of put these two pitch tracks together. So then for pitch range expansion, it seems that from this last example that we saw with respect to the polar questions, we see full or total pitch range expansion, which increases the F0 range of the tone throughout the whole clause until the final end when it's going to, when we see a final lowering. But what we saw in constituent questions and in focus constructions, new information focus, we only saw partial pitch range expansion, which I would like to then say, is this an indication of pre-focus pitch raising? So the full pitch range expansion, we can mark in terms of the intonation. It makes sense to mark that with a left edge high boundary tone, an intonational tone. And in a way that's in terms of phrasing or in terms of the scope that this left edge high intonational tone would have, we can see that it's going to be across the whole domain. And then we have this pitch range expansion. So now the question is, how do we mark the pre-focus pitch raising that we see, which is only affecting a part of the domain which is preceding the focus? So if it's marked at the left edge, and I had that in sort of the sort of pictures, the pitch tracks that I was showing, then the question is, how do we mark where it's going to end? And the point where it's going to end is not a point. So this is immediately after the verb, or immediately at the verb. So then at the verb, the expansion ends, and then the following constituent is the one that's in focus. At the verb, if you've got a verb-object construction, is not a domain in which we usually would have a phonological phrase boundary. So it seems to be, it would seem to be weird to then have a right edge intonational tone at the end of the verb. So then the question arises, and if you looked at all of those pictures, you could just sort of say, actually, maybe this is just pitch range compression that you're having after the focus and after the question. So given that the focus and the question words do not get any prominence, could it be that we should say that actually the marking of focus, whether it's a focus word or whether it's a question, is something that's marked by compression, or it's just an extension of the lowering that we get? So this severe reduction in the F0 range. I think no, at least that's what I think, and it'd be interesting to hear what other people think, because the compression, at least when you have that with respect to right dislocated, subjects and objects, looks very distinct. So it really looks, extremely flat, and the range in which the occurrence of a compressed constituent is really very, very small. So here is, a couple of examples. So this is a subject which is, right dislocated. So this is, the normal sentence would be, the women will saw the shorts today, and this is the women, being taken to the right. They will saw the shorts today, the women. And you can see even in this representation that yes, it sort of begins to go down after the verb, after going up, it kind of begins to go down. But then again, the constituent that is compressed, we don't even get anything in the 150 Hertz range, so that it's really Vahanamayo, which is the subject, which is really compressed here. And you can listen to this. And I thought I had a sort of little orange marking here. Yeah. So this is the constituent which is compressed, and it's really the range in which it is really very small, and seems, really seems to contrast with the preceding domain where we have today the adverb. Again, this is an example where this is the teacher. So the whole constituent, the teacher, is kind of what's compressed here. And again here, maybe it looks a little bit more tricky than the previous example. But the idea here would be to say that one has full compression of the teacher, but really the part which is well here doesn't look particularly different from the one which is supposed to be the full compression. And what's of course interesting that interacts with it as well is that this wino is all low toned. So that may well also be playing a role in that. So then, is it the case that actually information that follows the verb is just naturally always compressed, or can one see a difference between a right dislocated constituent where you seem to have full compression, in contrast when you've got a focus or when you've got a question word? Yes, this is the same thing, and here there is a dislocated object. So this object is outside of the main verb, main domain where the verb and the adverb are. So here it seems as if we are getting final lowering, the cursor, final lowering at the end of wino. And again, here we see a more gradual fall than we saw in the other instance. So this is a regular sentence where, you know, they read well is within the same phrase, and this is outside of it. This looks much more compressed than the wino does in this instance. And this is also an example where we, you know, where we have a downstep here as well. So it seems as if in this case as well, we see, I have lost my, yeah, okay. So this would be the word book here is compressed and is very flat and is in a very, in a pitch range, which is really not very wide at all. So this is just showing what the downstep is. So now moving a little bit to this mismatch that I'm kind of interested in, just to say something with this one slide on what phonological phrasing looks like in Bemba. And this is sort of common for a number of Eastern Bantu languages. And I'm interested in cases where you've got a verb and you've got an object. So when you've got a verb and an object and an adjective and an adverb, as we have here, you usually would have the verb and the object, at least you do in Bemba, phrased together in contrast to the adverb. The subject tends to be phrased separately, at least in Bemba. There are examples in other Eastern Bantu languages like Chichewa where this is not the case, and the verb is in a different constituent. If you have a double object construction, the second object tends to be, you know, outside of this domain. And the marking or the decision of how do we decide what this phonological phrasing is something which is based on tone spreading. And I think I just talk about this extremely briefly, not on the next slide, but on the one after that. So I sort of will give you sort of the evidence of how this phrasing works. So in terms of the object focus that we saw, as well as the question word focus, the correlation, what does this correlate to in terms of phonological phrasing? In terms of phonological phrasing, the verb and the object are phrased together when this object is in focus, or when this is a question, word. And we had those examples where we had an adverb following, and this would be in a different constituent. Same thing when you've got sort of an object following. So then I'm trying to understand, or trying to sort of come up with, what would the intonational marking be to express this pre-verb, this pre-focus raising that we are sort of seeing. So here I'm sort of trying to think, what could these mappings be? So on the one hand, it might be nice to say that, so the bracket which is in bold is trying to show the intonation, and these are intonational tones. If we had the constituent where we are seeing this pre-focus marking or pre-focus raising happening is on the verb. So the question, you know, like I said before, is whether we have got an intonational high tone on the left edge, but then its domain is only the verb, whereas the following object, which is part of the phonological phrase, is not part of that pitch raising that we are seeing before the focus. So could there be a boundary after the verb? It's not clear that there would be, because we don't know what that would sort of, you know, coincide with. And then, of course, I think it would be really interesting to look at the structures where you have verb focus, where there really is verb focus in these constituents. So the way that it's marked currently in terms of representation in the preceding slides was that we had intonationally a high intonational tone, which affects the verb, which is then would affect only the verb, and then we would have to find some way of expressing that it doesn't extend to the following object. And the reason why, of course, it's important to distinguish that is because in the final form here, we have got polar questions where we do indeed have this intonational high, which is scoping over both the verb and the object. And for those cases, the marking always is that you've got this left edge, high intonational tone, which then would show intonational pitch range expansion over the verb and over the object, but then there would be final lowering on the right edge. So one idea would be to think, well, maybe we have to look further internally into the phonological phrasing and assume that there might be an intermediate phonological phrase inside of these, the bigger phonological phrase, which would allow us to sort of capture the domain of pre-focus raising. And I'm almost at the end, and I want to just make this correlation with this conjoint disjoint idea that we know that we have in Bantu. So this is a distinction where you've got verb forms, and usually this can be morphologically marked, where you actually have got a morpheme which marks that a verb is disjoint, and a different morpheme which marks that a verb is conjoint. And Bemba also has that, but in addition to this, I have been arguing in some other work that actually the conjoint disjoint in Bemba can also be shown by how the high tone spreads. So if you've got, the main thing in terms of constituency seems to be that if you've got a disjoint form of the verb, then if there is any constituent that is following the verb, it tends to be extra clause or outside of the clause. If you've got a conjoint form of the verb, if the verb is marked for conjoint, then a following constituent is going to be within the same domain. And usually this is associated with focus. In terms of this being marked by tone, so here I've got a tense in Bemba, this is the future tense, where the conjoint disjoint is not marked by any morpheme. So this is just the future marker, and this is an object marker, mu, and this is the verb. So what we see in terms of tone is that we've got a lexical high tone, which is the one which is underlined here in va, and then this high tone spreads right up to the end of the domain. And this spreading up to the end of the domain indicates that this is a disjoint form. If there was anything that was following here, for example, we mentioned who this person was, John, Bakamupata John, then John would be something which would be outside of the clause. Actually, I should have just put a name there as well. So this could have a following constituent, but there is a break at the verb, and this is cueing where the phonological phrase boundary is. In contrast to that, when the tone doesn't spread up to the end, then any following constituent is within the same domain as the verb, and that constituent is going to be in focus. So this is what's happening on the phonology side in terms of phonological phrasing and in terms of focusing. So here we've got this ternary domain where the va spreads 2 times into the verb, but doesn't spread any further. So you can see that this is clearly, I hope that you can see, or it's convincing that this is because there's a following constituent, because in the form above, exactly the same verb form, exactly the same segmental structure, this part is still lexically low tone. So in essence, there is a host for a following high tone to spread, but it doesn't spread any further. And the reason it doesn't spread any further is because there's a following constituent, and this is, in a way, in inverted commas, a way of marking this disjoint form. And it's correlated with well being focused. So they hate him well and properly. So where well, somehow, this is a constructed example, obviously, is in focus. So what's interesting about this is that, in a way, it's correlating to some extent, but not perfectly. So when we saw the expansion before the focus, we saw that the whole verb was expanded until the end of the verb, and then everything else, was not, expanded, whatever we want to however we might want to analyze that. But it kind of is correlating with this idea that in the case where you would have a following focus constituent, or where you would have a question word, you would use the conjoint verb form. So therefore, it looks as if this tonal marking seems to be being mirrored in what we are seeing in the intonation, only the intonation is not stopping partway through the verb. So actually, in terms of the intonation is looking like raising everything is looking more like what the disjoint form looks like. So on the one hand, there's a kind of match, if you think about it just in terms of information, that you have to give some prominence to a constituent which is before the verb, before the focus, or before the question. We are seeing it in these examples, and we are also seeing it in the intonation, but the intonation is implementing this in a different way because we are seeing the expansion being across the whole verb. So that's it. That's really all I wanted to say. So here are the conclusions. So there is evidence, and it will be interesting to hear what everyone has to say about that, of pre-focus raising in Venda that applies in constituent questions and in focus constructions here in new information focus. This differs from pitch range expansion that applies across the whole polar question. For example, that it's not subject to, pitch range expansion is not subject to downstep, but the pre-focal raising is. There is a mismatch between phonological phrasing and the domain of pre-focus raising, indicating that it may only be marked by a left edge bracket of minus high. So here I am thinking of sort of saying that, thinking of sort of the idea of left aligned languages and right aligned languages. Could it be the case that what we are seeing in this pre-focus marking is going with those languages which says that there is left alignment, so you only mark the left edge and you don't mark what else is coming, leaving questions, of course, about how we distinguish pitch range expansion and this prefocal raising. So there's interesting interaction with the phonologically marked conjoint disjoint distinction, with some parallelism shown between them, but the implementation in the intonation being differently. And then just to say, of course, to nod towards what I really was supposed to do in this talk, it remains to be seen whether these verb focus patterns, also verb focus pattern shows the same, this pre-focus marking, and that would be, you can kind of see that it really can't. So you've got a subject and then you've got a verb. So if the verb was in focus, would the subject have prominence? But we know that actually the subject has always got a final fall at the end of it. We've got this lowering. So it's not clear what pre-focus marking would be if the verb was the constituent that would be in focus. And then the other thing would be really importantly to try and see how do these patterns replicate over more naturalistic data or over different genres. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. We already have some questions coming in. The first question is by Cedric Patin at University of Lille. Yeah.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you for this nice talk. So I'm not sure it will work well with the end of your talk, but I was thinking of Japanese accent when listening to you, where the accent is falling from a high pitch to a low pitch. And I was wondering if instead of pre-focus raising, you may have a focus that is signaled by a falling from a high register to a low register on the focused element. And that would also be the case for the polar question, where you will have this falling in the end, because so the low in the end will be this kind of signal. But for the conjoint disjoint, I'm not sure it works. But,
I see. Yeah. Yes. No. I'm really not. That may well be the case. I'm absolutely open to this because I'm not quite sure. I think also because for some questions, for some sentences which are, I see a slightly similar structure in sort of declaratives a little bit, that the subject tends to go a little bit high, but then you just see that bigger. So it's a question of, could it just be that it's just the high low that is kind of giving the indication? I guess that could be it. So that's why I was sort of trying to look at those examples where I wanted to see if something was really right dislocated, can we easily tell still the structure of the rise fall when there's a following constituent after the focus which is compressed? And in some examples you could see it, and in some examples you could see it less well. So I'm not sure it matters that much, but of course if it was trying to show that the constituent after the verb is the one that's in focus, and what is really showing us that is the fall, then there really should be a nice break between the focus constituent and something else that's following that's compressed, which in any case is what I would like to argue. It's just I'm seeing it less clearly. But that's, yeah, that's interesting. Maybe I should look at these Japanese examples where they show this, yeah, going up and down. Interestingly, actually, something that I have read on Japanese is somebody wrote a paper where there was an example from Nagoya Japanese where they were talking about pre-focus marking. So I know about that, and actually I was making connections with that. And but it's interesting to see whether if in other dialects of or other versions of Japanese, it actually goes differently. Sorry, you were going to say something today.
I was just saying thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next is next question comes from Frank Kügler at University of Frankfurt.
Thank you, Nancy. Very nice talk and fascinating data that you presented. So I have a question or suggestion, discussion around the phrasing issue, where you said that you start with the left edge intonational high tone at the verb, and then the object is in focus, or the question marker is represents the object, and you see there not a clear indication of some phrasing boundary. But so you don't see a right edge boundary. But what would happen if you assume a left edge boundary, so that the object or the question marker actually has a left and a right edge boundary predicted by these match constraints? Which is not the same level than the preceding left edge boundary at the verb, but maybe not a maximal phonological phrase, but a non-maximal phonological phrase, to say that. And then this left edge boundary, the left edge boundary at the verb is somehow indicated by this fall. So the raising, the prefocal raising, is stopped there. So there you have then maybe a left edge low phonological phrase boundary tone that makes the raising stopping. This was just a thought that I had, and I don't know if this would be consistent in the data, but this so maybe you can say something about that.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I mean, that would be consistent, with I guess it would be consistent with the data in as far as that's the point at which you see something. So it's true, I was kind of, maybe my thinking of it was thinking of a right edge, boundary, but then it doesn't have to be a right edge boundary after the verb. So for me, I can see that that's a juncture, that's an important juncture, but maybe it could be that you think of it that it's a left edge, and then they would still be the coming right edge. So then the marking of the focus would be cued by the drop.
Yes.
So the only thing that I then, and it's true, this could just be that this is what the phrasing is from the point of view of the marking of the focus. It's just like in terms of the phonological evidence that we have for phonological phrasing, and of course maybe one has to change one's, this is also evidence that shows something else, but from phonological phrasing in terms of those tone patterns, it looks as if those tone patterns indicate that I guess anyway. So I was going to say, and now I'm backtracking, I was going to say that the phonological phrasing indicates that the verb and the object are in the same domain, but of course I think your point could also be taken as, yes, they're in the same domain at a particular level of phrasing. Yes. But so that could be at the maximal level of phrasing, they're in the same domain, but at a minimal intermediate phrasing level, they are in different domains.
That's, that's the suggestion.
Yeah. I see that. Yeah, that's really worth thinking about. Thank you. Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Time, I think, because it's getting late and some people might want to rush. Let's thank Nancy one more time. Please send her applause. Like not send, or like react on her applause. And let me, before we conclude, actually, we will have some more time. This room will be open a little bit more. So if you have more questions or discussion that you want to briefly make with Nancy and or Frank, please stay. And let me close the event first. I thank you for both. I thank both Frank and Nancy for presenting their work today. And this event was possible because we had two assistants, actually three assistants, and two assistants, Yukki, Baldoria, Wu, and Miyu, Iizuka, was behind the Zoom organization. And we also had the Liaison Institute assistant, Michinori Suzuki. And this particular event was supported by shared budget of ICU Research Institutes and Institute for Education Research and Service and the Linguistic Lab at International Christian University. I also want to advertise some events of ICU Linguistic Colloquium on prosody. The next event will be on November 7th, 2 weeks from now. And on that day, Shin Ishihara from Lund University in Sweden and Cedric Patin from Université de Lille in France will share their work. We also have a phonetic talk series going on. And next Sunday, on October 31st, we have Donka Steriade from MIT presenting her work. So if you can join that event, that would also be great. And all information all the information is available on the website. And yeah, thank you for participating in today's colloquium, and I hope to see you in next colloquia as well. The recording will stop now.